Welcome to an episode of Palmer Village's Palmer Voices, a personal story project preserving artifacts and diverse personal accounts of life in the villages of Palmer. Stories of ordinary people are extraordinary. The history, the stories, and the artifacts from each village over the decades are what make Palmer unique. Brought to you by the Palmer Public Library, MPAC TV, and other local organizations. Funded in part by grants from the Leo S. Walsh Foundation and the Palmer Cultural Council, a local agency, supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. We hope you enjoy this Palmer story.
Theresa Woffenden Skaza grew up in Palmer, Mass. She went to Quabog Grammar School, then Palmer High School, graduated in 1971. Terry self-published a book in 2010 titled Casey at the Bat, A Family Tale. And she wanted to tell the story of her great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys. I'm Lisa Gagne, here for Palmer Village's Palmer Voices. And Terry is here with me today to talk about her great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys. And she has brought along several pictures and documents, and these items represent some of the many milestones and events in her life and in the town of Palmer. Terry, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Theresa Woffenden Skaza. I grew up in Palmer, and I did write the book, Casey at the Bat, A Family Tale.
Your curiosity about your grandfather started in your 20s?
Yes, I was still living with my parents. I went down the basement, and I saw some old boxes with papers and letters and postcards. And in one of those boxes, I found a huge marriage certificate. And I thought it was kind of cool because I had a picture of a bride and a groom in an oval shape. So I looked at it, and it was the marriage of George Whitefield D'Vys. And I was talking to my father about that, and he told me that was his grandfather, and that he wrote a poem called Casey at the Bat, but this man never got credit for that poem. So I thought, well, I might be doing some research on it. I might find it interesting. I had a lot of stuff to work with, so I started doing some research.
And then life got busy for you?
I graduated from Palmer High in '71, and then I got married to Jerry Skaza in 1977. Then we adopted our daughter in 1990. And then after that, I was a stay-at-home mom for a while.
Then life started to slow down a little bit for you.
Yes, I went to night school at Springfield Technical Community College. I worked during the day at Mass Mutual, and I went to school at night to earn a degree. And one of the classes I had was American Literature, and I decided to write an essay about my great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys. And I wrote the paper, and I got an A for my research. I was reading the paper, and I saw a picture of a man. I didn't know who he was, and his name was John Bowman, and he was doing some baseball research, which caught my eye because I'm interested in baseball research. And so I decided to write to him, to contact him. He lived in Northampton, and he wrote back to me. We kind of wrote back and forth, and he said he was interested in my research. And as it turned out, he ended up being my editor when I wrote my book. So he really helped me a lot.
Let's talk about your great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys.
He lived in the Boston, I think it was Somerville or Cambridge area for most of his life. He was married to this Silas Scribner. From what I've read, he claims, what never got credit for, that he wrote 32 lines, which is 8 stanzas, of the Casey at the Bat poem, and he put it in a newspaper called the New York Sporting Times, and that was in August of 1886. So he claims that's where it appeared, and he didn't put it under his name. It was under anonymous Somerville, Mass, because his parents didn't approve of any of his literary aspirations.
And what was the poem about?
He saw a baseball player called Mike King Kelly, who struck out in August of 1886, and D'Vys claims that inspired him to write this poem.
And then in June of 1888, something else significant happened.
In June of 1888, the poem then appeared in a newspaper called the San Francisco Examiner, and it was credited to a person by the name of Phin, P-H-I-N.
And do you know what Finn stood for?
Yes, Phin was the nickname of Ernest Lawrence Thayer, who claimed that he also wrote the poem, Casey at the Bat. And when he was at college at Harvard, he went by Finn or Finney or Phineas. That was his nickname, I guess. So he was the alleged author of the poem.
Would you like to recite that?
Sure, I'd love to recite it. Casey at the Bat poem. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat. No stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the Bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches black with people there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two." "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and echo answered fraud. But the scorn-filled look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain. And they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. So in 1897, the poem did appear in the Boston Globe. D'Vys did see it, and he was annoyed that someone tacked on some verses of his poem. So he was ill at the time when he saw that. He sent his mother to the Boston Globe with his proof of the New York Sporting Times paper and a letter from the editor of that paper. That was D'Vys's proof. So he sent those to the Globe with his mother. So they said, the Globe people said, well, we'll give him credit, don't worry. So she left. And then what happened was when D'Vys was well enough to go, he went to the Globe people at the Boston Globe, and they told him that too much time had elapsed, that they didn't know where his documents were, and basically it was lost.
And even by this time, the poem was made famous.
Well, it became famous by a person by the name of DeWolf Hopper, and he was a musical comedian of that day and age, and he used to recite the poem, Casey at the Bat. He recited it for over 30 years, I believe. He said he made the poem famous, but the poem made him famous as well.
But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out.
In 1908, the controversy continued, and Dr. Harry Thurston Peck did an investigation.
Yes, in 1908, because of the controversy around the poem, Dr. Peck, he was a professor of Latin at Columbia University. He was asked to do a literary investigation about this poem. So he did, and he asked Mr. D'Vys and Mr. Thayer to send him a signed affidavit about who, what, when, where, and why about this poem. So each one of the men did that, and he said about Mr. D'Vys, he said his conclusion was, as to the sincerity of Mr. D'Vys, I cannot say.
There was no determination either way on who wrote the poem.
No, there was really no conclusive proof as to who was the author of the poem at that point.
Fast forward to July of 1995.
Yes, Tom Shea wrote an article in 1995 about me and about my research about Casey at the Bat. And when it appeared in the paper, a person by the name of Al Slesinski apparently read that article, and he wrote a letter to Tom Shea and said, I knew George Whitefield D'Vys. He said, I knew the man, and I met him, and I heard him recite the poem. So I said, well, I need to find out who this Al Slesinski is. So I decided to write him a letter, and to find out that he lived in Palmer, I was just amazed. So it worked out quite well. So I wrote him a letter, and I said, could you tell me about my great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys? And he did. He wrote me a few letters. I wrote back to him. And he said that when he was working at Northampton State Hospital, George D'Vys was there because of his physical impairments. And he was there, and he met him, and he said he was mild-mannered and well-bred gentleman. And whenever he asked him to recite the poem, he would go and recite it, perfectly. And he said it was something he will never forget. And he also said, if I had known back then this man, I would have asked for his autograph. But he has since passed on, unfortunately. So this man, Albin Slesinski, that lived in Palmer here, he was a notable Palmer sports figure. He would go to all the sporting events at the schools and take pictures and then write stats on the back of them and give them to family members, which was a very nice thing. Palmer just recently named the sports fields at Palmer High School after Al Slesinski. They have a sign up there, and it's named after him.
So your great-grandfather, George Whitefield D'Vys, had some other literary pursuits. What other kind of works did he do?
Yes, he did various other things. I have a scrapbook of his at home that it's filled with short stories that he wrote, over probably 400 short stories. He published a hardcover book called On and Offshore that I found in the Somerville Public Library. I was happy to find that. So he had that published. And then he had a little pamphlet type book. It was called Casey at the Bat and Other Mudville Poems that I found in those boxes. And he wrote some lines for some music. He did various poems, lots of poems that I would someday like to publish that were unpublished. He wrote another poem called The Singer. And when I read it, I thought, that's kind of interesting, kind of sad too. But that was his poem. He wrote it later on in his life. And that was for his unanswered quest for fame. And now the poem, The Singer, by George Whitefield D'Vys. Long, long ago, men said that fame would seek this singer with her crown, and on her scroll would write his name with other names of high renown. And as the numbers that he sung seemed echoes from some fairy shore, 'twas said oftentimes he dwelt among the masterminds of days of yore. His songs were full of hope and cheer, oft rippling with the purest mirth, while God's great love he made so clear, the world was better for his birth. All heard these songs from city ways, from sea and woodland's wild retreat, and listening would foretell what praise was his when fame would turn her feet. They said she was in far-off lands, so waited yet with hearts elate, nor dreamt that he, within his hands, held high the cup of bitter fate. For lo, when fame did come his way, she found him in a darkened room, and coming was in time to lay her crown of laurel on his tomb. He was listed in Who's Who in America. He also had some envelopes made up, and I had a bunch of them, and it said Casey at the Bat by George Whitefield D'Vys. So I don't know if he used those envelopes, but he had envelopes made up saying that he was the true author.
What are your final thoughts after talking to Al and doing your research? What are some of your final thoughts on the controversy?
I believe that my great-grandfather wrote some lines of that poem and never got credit. So I would just like to give him some credit. If he's got credit due, then I'll give it to him. I did find an old copy of the New York Sporting Times, and I wanted to know the publication dates. And I found that it was published in 1885. His poem could have appeared in the New York Sporting Times in 1886, as he claims. So still research has to be done, I guess.
Sounds like a real adventure for you to find this out.
Well, I hope someday to find that New York Sporting Times paper, and that would be my absolute proof that that's where the poem came from.
And what date are you looking for?
In case anybody is out there and has a New York Sporting Times newspaper, it would be I believe it's August 10th, 1886. It appeared in that newspaper.
We wish you luck in your quest.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for talking with me, Terry. I learned a lot today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. A Ray of Sunshine. These are weekly poems that George D'Vys had published in 1918 in a newspaper called The Tribune. And this is the first poem that was in that Ray of Sunshine paper. A word, my friend, before you start. Be sure the course you choose is right. Then when you're sure, just do your part. And though the world opposes, fight. The people's judgment oft is wrong, so hold your views through thick and thin. With your convictions clear and strong, have confidence, stand firm, and win.
This has been another recording of Palmer Village's Palmer Voices, brought to you by the Palmer Public Library in collaboration with the Leo S. Walsh Foundation, MPAC TV, Palmer Historical and Cultural Center, Palmer Historical Commission, Palmer Cultural Council, Mass Cultural Council, and Elbow Plantation Historical Society. To become a part of tomorrow's History Today, contact the Palmer Public Library to share your Palmer story. If you know someone whose story should be preserved, we'd love to hear about it. For more information, visit our website at palmerlibrary.org/palmervoices.